Welcome to the Dance Lens podcast, where we take a deep dive on all things dance. We'll look at how the art form is woven into politics, history, and cultural developments, and we'll draw back the curtain on the lives of the artists in conversations with dancers, choreographers, directors, set and costume designers, and more. If you're in the industry or a curious listener, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Cynthia Dragoni. Thanks for listening and enjoy. Welcome to the first in our ballet story series, where you'll learn the story of a famous ballet and we'll take a look at some of the important artists associated with the work. And in the case of this first story, the importance of the ballet across both dance and music. First up is the Firebird, a mysterious amalgamation of Russian fairy tales, originally staged by Diaghilev and the famed Ballets Russes Company. Firebird was a catalyst for massive evolution and artistic upheaval in ballet, but also, it may surprise you, in jazz music. Our story starts as all great stories do. Once upon a time, a long time ago, in Russia, there lived a prince named Ivan. And Ivan was intelligent and kind and brave. And he heard of a magical golden apple tree that whenever someone went to look for it, they never returned. So Ivan thought to himself, I shall go and look for this tree, and I shall return. So Ivan set off into the forest in the night. And he was walking when far away he saw a giant golden glow, and he thought, that must be the tree. And as he approached the glow, he saw there was a beautiful magical tree. But suddenly, down from the sky came flying a bird completely made of fire. She was so beautiful, and her feathers, her flaming feathers, were red and orange and yellow and even a little blue. And Ivan watched as she flew round the tree and played with its fruit and danced in the garden in front of the tree. Ivan thought to himself, I am a prince, and I should have this magical creature for my own. So he snuck up behind the Firebird and threw his arms around her. But she begged and she pleaded to be set free. Now remember, Ivan was a kind man, so he opened his arms to set her free. To thank him, the bird reached back and she pulled out one of her magical feathers, and she said, My prince, take this feather, and if you ever need my help, wave the feather, and I shall come and help you. Ivan took the feather, and he bowed his head to thank her. And when he looked up, she was gone. Ivan looked around the garden in front of the golden apple tree when he heard voices and footsteps, so he jumped and hid behind one of the other trees. And he noticed there was a gate behind the golden apple tree that he hadn't noticed before. And the gate opened, and out from it came a beautiful young woman, and then another, and another, and another, and another, until finally there were 13 of these beautiful women, and they were dancing and chatting and playing games with the apples. And one of them, the most beautiful, the most charismatic, and such a fantastic dancer, stood out to him, and he fell immediately in love. So he decided to introduce himself. Stepping out from his hiding place, all of the young women were scared, but he said, Don't worry, I have not come to harm you. My name is Ivan, and I am a prince. The most beautiful of them stepped forward, and she said, My name is Ekaterina, and we are princesses captured by the evil magician Katschei, and if he finds you here, he will turn you into stone. It was at this moment that Ivan realized why none of the other people who had gone to look for the tree ever came back. And Ivan said, "I am not afraid of this evil magician, Katschei." Now, Katschei lived in the palace that was behind the gate, behind the golden apple tree. And he heard voices in the garden, and one of the voices he didn't recognize. By this time, it was time for the princesses to go back inside the gate into the palace. And Ivan watched as they ran through, and he thought to himself, "I must set them free." So he went and he opened the gate, and out came pouring monsters and creatures and the evil magician Katschei himself. And they all surrounded our prince, and Katschei was pulling him towards him with his magic, about to cast an evil spell on him, when Ivan remembered that he had the magical feather. So he took it out and waved it, and true to her word, the Firebird appeared from the sky. Now, our evil magician Katschei got very angry because he realized that putting a spell on Prince Ivan wasn't going to be as easy as he thought it was. So in his anger, he made all of his creatures and all of his monsters do a terrifying, frenzied dance called the Inferno Dance. But our Firebird, she was also very powerful and very magical, and she did a beautiful dance, and she flew through the sky, and she moved slowly, and she was so mesmerizing that the monsters and the creatures and the princesses started to follow her and do exactly what she did. And she did a slow, slow dance to a lullaby. And they were all hypnotized, and she put them all to sleep. Now, the only ones awake in the garden were Katschei, the Firebird, and Prince Ivan. And Katschei was terrified because he knew that the Firebird knew his secret. And the Firebird told Prince Ivan what to do. She said, "Beneath the golden apple tree is a box, and inside the box is a giant egg, and inside this egg is Katschei's soul." So Ivan went beneath the tree, and he opened the box, and he lifted the egg into the air, and he smashed it on the ground. And they watched as Katschei's soul floated up into the night sky, and the magician lay crumpled in a pile on the floor. At this moment, the princesses started to wake up, and the creatures and the monsters, they not only started to wake up, but one by one, the creatures, the monsters, and the stone statues turned back into people. And our beautiful Princess Ekaterina and Prince Ivan were wed. But they never saw their Firebird again. And they never forgot about her and how she had saved them all. The Firebird is a mashup of different Russian fairy tales and was created by the Ballets Russes as a way to showcase the Russian soul through true Russian ballet, as in the idea of Russia, not the glittering czar's Russia, but the more Muscovite pagan Russia. Really, it's like an ephemeral feeling of a people, an idea of themselves that may or may not have ever existed. First performed in 1910, it catapulted a heretofore unknown Stravinsky to international fame, and it was his score that was the real pivot point for developments in ballet and music, as we shall see. But first, let's look at how this ballet was almost something quite different. The musical commission was actually offered originally to 3 different composers who either weren't interested or didn't have the goods. So Diaghilev, remember the director of the Ballets Russes, thought that he would ask young Stravinsky to take the project, thinking that he's young and he'll say yes to anything. And he was right. Once the score was written, The ballet needed to be cast, and the title role was originally offered to prima ballerina Anna Pavlova, but she couldn't stand Stravinsky's music, and it instead went to ballerina Tamara Karsavina. This sounds a little funny to us today, knowing what an important ballet this turned out to be, but you have to remember, Stravinsky was unknown. His music was a universe away from other ballet composers such as Minkus and even Tchaikovsky, and Pavlova was a star, quite comfortable in her classical repertoire. Why would she go to the bother? She wasn't the only dancer, even decades later, who felt that way. Gilsey Kirkland talks about struggling with Stravinsky's score in her book, Dancing on My Grave. Now, what's important here is not only the musical score, but the fact that it was a hit. What's important here is not only the score, but the fact that it was a hit. Because Firebird was so successful, Stravinsky was given another commission by Diaghilev, and this time for the Rite of Spring. And while the Rite of Spring became a hugely influential work, it was decidedly not a hit when it was first performed, so much so that it actually caused a riot in the theater. Words were said, the police were called, and it solidified Stravinsky as an artist beyond the leading edge of his field. The same genius who commissioned the Firebird and Rite of Spring, Sergei Diaghilev, introduced Stravinsky to the choreographer George Balanchine. Fun fact, Diaghilev was also responsible for naming Balanchine, whose original given family name was the Georgian Balanchevadze, and Diaghilev made him change it to Balanchine. George Balanchine would go on to become the founder of New York City Ballet and is responsible in many ways for the explosion of ballet in the U.S. And while we always wish the ballet world in this country were bigger, it would be a much smaller affair without him and the seeds that the New York City Ballet movement, in several senses of the word, spread throughout the land. Many of the New York City Ballet stars and Balanchine disciples ended up at the helm of new ballet companies made in New York City Ballet's image, including Pennsylvania Ballet, now Philadelphia Ballet, Miami City Ballet, Pacific Northwest Ballet, and San Francisco Ballet, which had already existed but was brought to a world-class level once New York City Ballet star Helgi Tomasson took over. To begin to understand the partnership between Balanchine and Stravinsky, we have to remember that Balanchine trained at the Imperial Theater in St. Petersburg, but he also graduated from the Petrograd Conservatory of Music, where he was fully trained as a musician and a composer, which meant that he and Stravinsky met each other, not as two artists from separate fields, but as peers, two musicians working on varied instruments in sound and in body. Their first collaboration was in 1928 on Apollon Musagate, later renamed Apollo, and Stravinsky's music has been used in more than 30 important works for New York City Ballet's rep, including Balanchine's Firebird, of course, Agon, Stravinsky Violin Concerto, Duo Concertant, and Rubies, just to name a few. The ballets that they collaborated on embodied the modernism that was the artistic zeitgeist of the time. No longer would ballet solely be associated with bloated story ballets filled with page dances, pantomime, thinly masked plot devices that really served as excuses for dance parades. No, these new ballets were sleek, cool, disconcerting, and beautiful. And from them came the neoclassical era, which led to the contemporary work of choreographers like William Forsythe, among many others, spawning generations of new works and new ways of thinking about the art form. Stravinsky both influenced and was influenced by jazz music. When he composed the Firebird in 1910, he wouldn't have heard any jazz music played in real time. He was in Paris, but many now think that he was inspired by the scores that his friend, conductor Ernest Ansermet, brought to Paris from the US, thought to be early ragtime copies. and his music contained many elements that were uncommon or unheard of in classical music and would later be thought of as the makings of jazz music. Although many of his works, and certainly the early ones, didn't have key things like improvisation that were in some ways later considered the soul of jazz. And the Rite of Spring had a known influence on jazz musicians. The great Charlie Parker said that it was his favorite piece of music. So you see, it really was the Firebird that was a catalyst for a completely new era in both dance and in music. Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want more dance content, you can follow me on TikTok and YouTube or sign up for the email list at cynthiadragoni.dance. I'll leave you with this quote from the revolutionary choreographer Martha Graham. "One does not choose to be a dancer. One is chosen. And with that, you live all your life." Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Dance Lens podcast. Bye-bye.